With a history marked by moments of extreme suffering and brutality during its thousands of years in our world, humanity has witnessed countless acts of cruelty that make us reflect to this day on whether or not there are limits to human evil. And it is with this in mind that we have prepared a list of some of the most cruel and perverse forms of punishment ever practiced throughout history to present in today's video. 20 worst tortures in the history of humanity. Brazen Bull. And opening our list of cruel tortures in human history is a device that can be defined as extremely distressing and dark, the Brazen Bull. Attributed to the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas and the craftsman Paralo of Athens, this machine was a hollow bronze sphinx in the shape of a bull. The victim was placed inside the bull, which was then heated by a fire below, causing the person inside to suffer terribly from the extreme heat. In addition, the bull's design included a system that made the victim's screams sound like the animal's bellowing, a macabre detail that reflected the cruelty of this torture system. According to the story, Paralo, who invented the bull, was the first victim to be placed inside it to demonstrate its workings to Phalaris, but he was taken out alive and thrown off a cliff to die. Curiously, according to the story, in a twist of fate, Phalaris, the tyrant responsible for ordering the construction of this torture machine, ended up being executed in the public square inside it, following a rebellion by his people against his tyranny. Impalement. Impalement is a highly cruel type of torture and execution that was widely used by various civilizations around the world, especially in Arabia and Europe. This method of torture was used to punish various crimes, such as treason, rebellion, or murder, and consisted of inserting a stake through the tortured person's body, which could be inserted through the anus, vagina, or any other part of the body. The victim was usually tied up or restrained before the stake was inserted into their body, causing indescribable agony as the stake pierced vital organs, causing intense pain, internal bleeding, and irreversible damage, where the victim usually experienced nausea, vomiting, and difficulty breathing, until the moment of death finally arrived, which in this case was a release from the excruciating pain. Rat torture. Throughout history, people have always been afraid and repulsed by rats, both because they transmit diseases and because they are considered to be real pests, especially when they are found in large numbers and are capable of generating huge losses or damage, especially in the food industry. But we mustn't forget that rats are rodents, and if that doesn't sound scary to you, perhaps after learning about this next torture involving these animals you'll change your mind. This is because rat torture, as it became popularly known, was a practice that basically consisted of placing a live rat in the victim's belly, trapped inside a metal cage or bucket so that it couldn't escape, and then applying heat, usually in the form of a hot coal or iron, to this structure. In this way, as the rat tried to escape the heat, it would bite and scratch the victim's skin, causing intense pain, bleeding, and, in some cases, serious infections. In more advanced cases, the animal would even pierce the tortured person's skin and organs in an attempt to escape the heat, often even coming out of the victim's mouth, which inevitably led to their death. Rat torture caused extreme and unimaginable suffering to the victim, both physically and psychologically, and was often used to obtain information or even false or dubious confessions, as the victim, in excruciating pain, would say anything to stop the torture. Death by sawing. Now we're going to talk about a method of torture with a simpler process to understand, but which is no less terrifying. We're talking about the torture popularly known as death by sawing, a horrible and cruel method of execution in which the victim was usually tied to a wooden structure with their head down and then began to be cut in half, usually starting with the lower parts and going up to the head. As you can probably imagine, this practice caused excruciating pain and unimaginable suffering, and in many cases, to further increase the victim's suffering, the torturers could intentionally slow down their movements, prolonging the torture for hours, so that death usually occurred only when the saw hit the victim's chest or abdomen, causing fatal damage to vital organs. Wooden horse. The wooden horse was a medieval torture device used to punish and humiliate its victims. Its simple and brutal structure consisted of a triangular-shaped wooden rack with a sharp edge at the top. The victim was forced to sit on the edge, with their legs spread and their body suspended in the air, bearing all their weight on their pelvic bones and genitals. Similar to rat torture, the wooden horse was often used to obtain information and confessions from prisoners by inflicting excruciating pain. The torture could last for hours or even days, depending on the victim's resistance and the cruelty of the torturer. In many cases, to make the torture worse, weights were tied to the victim's ankles, which obviously made the consequences of the wooden horse on the victim's health even more devastating, leading to death in most cases. Bamboo torture. Bamboo torture is another horrific method of torture and execution that is said to have been used in East and South Asian countries, such as China, India, and Japan. Something that many people are unaware of is the fact that bamboo is an extremely fast-growing plant, with some species growing up to 1 meter in just 24 hours, and this torture is directly related to this factor. This is because, according to reports, the bamboo torture consisted of the victim being tied to a growing bamboo shoot, so that as the bamboo grew, it ended up going through the victim's body, piercing organs and tissues over days or weeks, causing a slow and painful death. Chinese water torture. Unlike the other torture methods we've seen so far, the Chinese water torture didn't focus mainly on inflicting physical harm on the tortured, but was extremely effective at causing psychological damage. The victim would be tied up or restrained so that they were immobile, and then a constant drop of cold water would begin to drip onto their forehead, usually in the area between the eyebrows. The rhythm of the drops used to be slow, irregular, and unpredictable, intensifying the suffering of the victims who developed intense anxiety as they tried to anticipate the next drip. In this way, although it doesn't seem like such an intense and cruel type of torture, the Chinese water torture caused devastating psychological effects, with factors such as the incessant sound of dripping water, the feeling of impotence and sleep deprivation causing effects of extreme stress, anxiety, paranoia, and hallucinations. And all of this could be even worse in cases where the victim was convinced that the water dripping on his head could be poisoned, for example, thus generating even more anguish, fear, and distress in the tortured person who feared the possible effects of the poison, even though in fact the water was pure and had nothing harmful in it. Judas chair. Known as the Judas chair, this cruel and terrible instrument of torture, used mainly during the Spanish Inquisition, was a pyramid-shaped device made of wood or metal with a sharp point at the top. The victim was tied up and forced to sit on the top of the pyramid, with the sharp point penetrating their bodily orifices. The torture was gradually intensified by lowering the victim further and further onto the point, causing excruciating pain, lacerations, and bleeding. In addition to physical pain, the Judas chair inflicted humiliation, psychological suffering, lasting trauma, and, as you can imagine, in more advanced cases, death. Iron Maiden. Another device specially developed to generate extreme pain and suffering during the torture process, the Iron Maiden. Although its use is questioned by some historians, the Iron Maiden has become one of the greatest cultural symbols of torture in history. It is a metal sarcophagus, usually in the shape of a human figure, with the face adorned with the appearance of a woman. The victim was imprisoned inside this device, and the doors were closed by pressing them against sharp skewers positioned on the inside walls. These skewers varied in size and shape, piercing different parts of the body, and were usually positioned in such a way as not to directly hit the victim's vital organs, which prolonged the torture process even more, since the tortured person could spend hours or even days with these skewers penetrating their body, resulting in a slow and painful death. White torture. Just like the Chinese water torture that we've already shown you, white torture is also a type of psychological torture that aims to deprive the prisoner of senses and completely isolate them, in most cases causing serious, irreversible psychological damage. Picture something simple in your mind and answer honestly. How long do you think you could go without talking to someone? Or, if that sounds easy to you, how long can you go without using your smartphone? We have to admit that at this point things already seem to get more complicated, don't they? Now imagine being placed in a completely white room, white bed, white toilet, white table, and white walls. And let's not forget that the clothes you wear should also be white, and that the food served should also be white, with white plates and cutlery too. And that's basically what white torture consists of. Obviously, we don't even need to mention the fact that during this torture, the condemned person couldn't communicate with anyone, let alone use a smartphone or similar communication device. Finally, the tortured person could spend days, weeks, or even months in this situation, completely deprived of any kind of interaction or contact with the outside environment. If all that wasn't enough, the tortured person was also incapable of having any notion of the passage of time, given that meals were served at random times, precisely to generate mental confusion and prevent them from counting the days they were held in the room. Well, after all this, you can imagine how damaging and overwhelming the effects of torture in the White Room were, where the tortured were completely deprived of anything other than their own mind, which in most cases ended up deteriorating rapidly. Head crusher. Back to physical torture, now it's time to talk about another cruel and frightening torture device, the head crusher. Widely used during the Spanish Inquisition, the head crusher was a device capable of causing irreparable pain and damage, and consisted of a helmet attached to a bar on which the victim's chin rested. As a screw above it was turned slowly, it put pressure on the victim's skull. This allowed the torturers to destroy the dental arches and jaws. And if the torture didn't stop, the eyeballs would pop out and the brain would be torn apart by the skull. Most of the time, the main purpose of the head crusher was to obtain confessions or information from the victims through excruciating pain, but in other cases it was also used as a form of public punishment, serving as a terrible warning to those who dared to defy the authorities. Rack. The rack was another cruel and sadistic instrument of torture used during the Middle Ages and early modern period. It consisted of a wooden structure, usually in the shape of a table, with rollers at each end. Victims were bound with their wrists and ankles tied to the rollers, and through a system of ropes and pulleys, these rollers were rotated slowly in opposite directions, stretching the victim's body in a brutal way. As in other cases we have seen, the main aim of this method of torture was to extract confessions from the victims, often through false promises of release in the event of an admission of guilt. And the result of being stretched on this device was usually the dislocation of the victim's elbows, knees, wrists, and heels. In addition, muscles and internal organs could also be stretched to breaking point. And it only took a short period of time being tortured in this device for the interrogatee to be mutilated for life, or in many cases, even killed. Crucifixion. Crucifixion is probably the best-known torture method on this list due to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ by the Romans. The victim was usually flogged before crucifixion, which caused deep wounds and bleeding, and then forced to carry his own cross to the place of execution. On arrival at the site, the victim was stripped naked and laid on the cross, with long, sharp nails being driven into their feet and wrists or into the palms of their hands, going through bones, tendons, and muscles. With the victim nailed to the cross, the structure was raised, suspending the body in the air, so that the weight of the body caused excruciating pain in the joints and muscles, and breathing became increasingly difficult. Crucifixion was a slow and agonizing process, which could last hours or even days, and the victim suffered from intense thirst, hunger, pain, and extreme exhaustion, with this suffering being further intensified by factors such as exposure to the sun, wind, and rain. When death finally came, it served as a release from suffering, and usually occurred through asphyxiation, caused by the combination of intense pain, difficulty breathing, and exhaustion. PEAR of anguish. The PEAR of anguish was another horrific medieval torture device used to punish victims, mainly homosexuals and women accused of crimes such as adultery, heresy, or witchcraft. Usually made of metal, its design resembled a pear, with 4 sharp segments that opened and closed by means of a screw or crank. Thus, during the torture process, the PEAR of anguish was inserted into the tortured person's vagina, anus, or mouth and then began to gradually expand, causing immense pain, lacerations, and irreversible damage to the victim's mouth or genitals. Scaphism. Scaphism was a method of torture and execution that consisted of imprisoning the victim between 2 wooden vessels, usually boats, with their limbs and head exposed through holes. The The condemned person was then force-fed milk and honey until they began to feel nauseous. After this, the victim's face, feet, and arms were also covered with the same mixture of milk and honey and then left exposed to the sun. This process was repeated for several days and was intended to make the victim vomit and defecate, attracting insects and other types of animals that began to eat the victim alive for days or weeks until they inevitably died. All these factors have led to scaphism being considered to this day as one of the worst and most macabre forms of torture in human history, given that as well as suffering from hunger, dehydration, serious infections, putrefaction of the skin, and the incessant attack of insects and other animals, this slow and painful process of death also caused extreme agony for the condemned who spent their days waiting and fully aware of the process of decomposition of their own bodies. Breast ripper. Another cruel and brutal method of torture that leaves us wondering, are there any limits to human cruelty? We're talking about the breast ripper, a terrible instrument of torture used during the Middle Ages, consisting of iron pincers with 4 sharp, converging claws, designed to tear off the breasts of condemned women and to cause as much pain and damage as possible in the process. In general, the breast ripper was mainly aimed at women accused of blasphemy, adultery, witchcraft, abortion, or other crimes considered serious by the Catholic Church at the time. Cat claws. Known as cat claws, due to their appearance resembling the claws of a feline, this is yet another device that has supposedly been used as a form of torture throughout history. The condemned person was usually tied up and then the torture began, with these claws being used to tear the flesh from the victim's body, usually removing it from the bone, in various parts of the body such as the face, back, or chest for example. This cruel device caused excruciating pain and severe mutilation, and the victim was often subjected to repeated sessions of torture, usually with the aim of obtaining information or confessions. Breaking wheel. The breaking wheel was another macabre instrument of torture and execution, which served as a brutal punishment for crimes ranging from treason and murder to heresy and blasphemy. In this torture process, the condemned person was tied to a large wagon wheel, and then their bones were broken with sticks and hammers. Furthermore, in another alternative form of torture, instead of being tied to a wheel, the condemned person was tied to an X-shaped cross, horizontally attached to a stake on which his body was then broken. In both cases, the condemned man's broken body was usually on public display. To make the effects of this torture even worse, the condemned person often didn't end up dying straight away, but in many cases spent a long period of anguish and suffering with their body limbs broken. And to give you an idea, there are reports of victims who survived for up to 4 days after the torture was applied. Blood eagle. The blood eagle was another method of torture and brutal execution that, according to historical accounts, was practiced by the Vikings centuries ago. The victim was usually tied up, and then their ribs were cut from the spine using a sharp tool, and their lungs pulled through the opening to create the appearance of a pair of eagle's wings, hence the inspiration for the name blood eagle. Of course, we don't even need to mention the fact that this torture caused unimaginable suffering and severe damage to the victim's muscles, bones, and organs, as well as bleeding and breathing problems, which inevitably led to their death. Death by 1,000 cuts. We've probably all had the experience of cutting some part of our body by accident at some point in our lives, whether it's through carelessness when handling a knife, for example, or even that classic cut on the knee caused by a sharp stone when we fall to the ground, right? And if any of these situations have happened to you, you must already know the enormous pain that a small cut like that can cause. Now imagine being tied up and having several parts of your body cut off without any chance of escape or defense. Surely just imagining that is a frightening experience, right? And that's basically what death by 1,000 cuts consists of, considered to be one of the worst forms of torture in all of human history. The condemned person was usually tied up in a place exposed to the public, and then small cuts were made on the extremities of their body, such as the ears, nose, and fingers. Gradually, the torture intensified and larger slices of flesh and muscle were removed from the victim's body, causing excruciating pain and intense bleeding. Worst of all, death was often slow in coming, with the victim remaining conscious for hours or even days, until they succumbed to exhaustion, hemorrhagic shock, or multiple organ failure. But what do you think? What was the worst and cruelest torture on this list? Let us know in the comments what you thought of the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all the content we bring here. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.